Mad Philosopher Podcast. It's Friday the 13th of November, 2015, and we're trying something a little bit new this week as well. I have on the line with me Ben Shade, who's an individual that I met on the internet through a series of fortunate circumstances. So I'll go ahead and let Ben introduce himself, and then we'll have a fun little conversation about whatever comes to mind.
Hi, as Joey said, my name is Ben. I have a website, benshade.com. I became an anarchist some time ago and then have since become friends with other anarchists. I'm looking forward to talking to Joe about this journey and maybe some opinions and ideas and things like that.
That's a good introduction. So I guess we just start off right off the bat with, how did you become an anarchist?
I was born an anarchist. It took me a while to figure it out.
That's a good answer. I hear that answer a lot.
Yeah.
It seems to be a kind of common conception that the human condition is one where you're either born with a blank slate or you're born with normal human intuitions, which involve things like the principle of non-aggression and things like that. And then from then on, you kind of develop all of these socially ingrained habits that are contrary to the normal human condition. So I imagine that's kind of what you say when you say, I was born an anarchist.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was born with an interest in investigation and trying to do things my own way. And I think fundamentally that's what anarchism means to me, is that as individuals, if everybody has the opportunity to try as many things as possible, things that someone else might think is a good idea, I certainly don't. And if they let me do the things that are bad ideas to them, by virtue of trying everything, we'll find the best things more quickly.
That would stand to reason. I mean, if we're only allowed to try a selected group of concepts or ideas or approaches to life, any options that are outside that realm that might be conducive to finding the right course or the best course would be out of the picture. So, let 1,000 flowers bloom and see which ones survive the oncoming storm of life, I guess.
Yeah, and I think a lot of libertarians see that in economics, where you say that the government's skewing things towards a particular avenue to solve a problem, as in corn production for food, and you end up with suboptimal outcomes because you're putting all your eggs in one basket, and centralization, and I mean, it gives power to individuals, which inevitably corrupts, and then it's not natural. So not everybody's designed to live on a diet of rice and beans and corn. It just doesn't provide the nutrients that they need. And it's better if you can self-optimize your diet. Or, that's a specific example, but there's others in economics that you skew the market and you have unintended consequences.
Yeah, again, it makes perfect sense looking at it from a sort of Austrian perspective in economics, which it sounds like you're at least passably familiar with the Austrian school.
Yeah.
The market operates based on signals and responses to those signals. So if an individual is interested in a particular product or service and they find a way to acquire that product or service, they exchange whatever goods or services are necessary to acquire it. It's a matter of personal cost-benefit analysis. But when you have somebody with so much power or authority in a particular market, it gives them an advantage in that they are able to send market signals that would not naturally occur. If you introduce the violence of the state, for instance, and tax people and then produce certain sort of welfare, for instance, corn subsidies, like you said, then it sends a market signal that's not a natural signal that, hey, corn is a profitable venture, even though it really shouldn't be. The costs and the gains of the corn industry are skewed in an unsustainable manner, where typically the free market would kind of allow a certain equilibrium of value between the cost and the benefit. So the same thing also applies, like you said, in diet, where if we're designed to eat a particular set of foods, or if we're designed for a particular type of activity, depending on whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist or somewhere in between, ultimately you can say there's a certain design that's a result of whatever process gave you that design. And then if you have a market signal that says McDonald's cheeseburgers are more affordable and keep you more full than, say, wandering off into the wilderness and eating the foods that were naturally available to our ancestors, then you're more likely to engage in unhealthy behaviors that are unsustainable, like living off of McDonald's cheeseburgers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I come from a background of biology. I have a bachelor's of science in biology and then a master's of science in molecular biology. And I work as a fermentation engineer. And so from that perspective is where I even came to my economic solutions, and that there's energy balances in all around us, and the structure required to sustain human beings is immense, down to the microbial level and all the megafauna and everything, plants in between. We need all of it in order to maintain the carbon cycle and to absorb sunlight and bring all the energy required into an organic form that we're able to consume and support ourselves. And this is sustainable because of the wide base, I guess I would say. It's like a pyramid. You have a very wide base, and if you build up slowly, you can reach a very high apex without fear of falling over. And when you erode your base, when you use violence to organize people without having their full support because of the value of the idea, you can maybe reach a higher level and produce something like a rocket that goes to the moon, but at the cost of the stability of the apex. And it's not going to be valuable for as long as the species whose base erodes will go extinct. And I think likewise, the state will eventually go extinct if they continue to use force instead of reason to accumulate power or to organize people.
That makes perfect sense. I'm just a little bit curious. I've had a passing kind of hobbyist familiarity with biology and chemistry. Of course, I'm a philosopher now, but for a while I was very interested in physics, especially physics dealing with large things, astrophysics and things like that. And just as a general interest in sciences and reason, biology was always kind of a side hobby of mine. So when you're talking about a kind of metaphorical pyramid, a structure of a ecosystem, are you talking about like single-celled organisms and how there's so many more single-celled organisms than plants, and then there's more plants than herbivores, and there's more herbivores than predators, and there's more predators than the apex predator like humans, for example? Or am I misunderstanding?
No, you're speaking exactly right. The energy flows up from the phytoplankton that absorbs sunlight and are getting eaten by the zooplankton, which get eaten by the larger and larger fish. And that's, at the base level, everything comes from the sun. So you have to have these plants, which I would call the bottom kind of. Now there's more complex plants that maybe aren't right on the bottom, but at a bacterial level, you have the absorption of energy and the organization of those molecules through these systems into the very complex proteins and carbohydrates, peptides that we need to sustain ourselves.
Perfect. I'm glad I understood that.
Yeah.
So I guess following the analogy then, when we're talking about, for instance, using the force or violence of the state in order to produce something amazing, like the moon landings or space bases or the nuclear bomb or whatever, frankly, amazing discovery or invention we've come up with, whatever accomplishment we've made as a society, narrows that avenue by which we would reach that same goal. So it's the idea of a tall, narrow tower versus a pyramid. And the tall, narrow tower, if hit with any sort of lateral force or any sort of erosion at that very narrow base, will cause it to topple over. Whereas with a pyramid, you could still ultimately reach the same altitude. It may even take a little bit longer, but once you get there, it's sustainable and it's not going anywhere, a la the pyramids that you see in Giza.
Exactly. And you can see, people say that our society is stable, but we're relatively, I would say, still fragile. if we were to disruptions to our current system, the way we live in cities are a very good example of this, where you congregate a large amount of biomass of people in one area, and the supply chains that they're dependent on are so many and so distant to gather up all the food to pile into one place to feed this mass of people, that they're susceptible to things like hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and where millions of people can starve in a matter of, or die very quickly just because of looting, chaos in the streets from disruption of the supply chain. Whereas in a truly anarchist society, you would have everything diversified and spread out and would be localized where you got your food from your neighbors, and you wouldn't have these incentives to pile up into cities, I don't think. At least not nearly as much the way the Native Americans lived. Although they had their fighting, they were spread out relatively well across the plains and didn't have nearly the environmental impact that we do.
Yeah. Again, we're in pretty much perfect agreement. A lot of previous posts that I've made have never explicitly addressed how exactly I find cities to be unsustainable, but they always make allusions to that. And one of the primary arguments I make is, one little thing goes wrong and the city infrastructure is no longer able to hold up that many people, whether it be tainted water supplies, or you barricade the highway for whatever reason, or a power transformer goes out. If it's not rectified within a short order of time, people are going to die of dehydration, of starvation. People are going to start eating each other, figuratively, if not literally, simply because if you take enough rats and cram them in a small enough box, even if they've got enough to eat, they'll start to eat each other because they want more space. Personal space, I guess, is an asset that most people don't seem to understand as an actual biological asset.
Oh, it's an absolute biological need. And we've seen this happen where in North Korea, in Russia, China, there's been opportunities for the government, not intentionally, I don't think all the time, but to inadvertently disrupt major supply chains to cities that have caused mass starvation of tens of millions of people. And it's just because they don't know what they're doing. They're pulling the levers of the economy in such a way as to disrupt these towers and knock them over, and it's cost tens of millions of lives.
It's absolutely tragic. And then people ask me why I'm okay with some sort of violence that might be inherent to what they call the anarchist system, when in all reality, it's just an anarchist world. But I turn around and just say, well, there's a certain set of violent tendencies that are inherent to every system. It's just a matter of whether it's one guy throwing levers and accidentally starving entire cities into non-existence, or whether it's a natural occurrence of biodiversity where the strong live and the weak die, not necessarily individuals, but as species, as ideas, as, again, biological assets allow.
And that's another thing that I try and speak to atheists, especially, who are evolutionists, which I definitely wouldn't call myself an atheist, but I have sympathies towards them. And that's, if you believe in evolution and atheism, and you say that these things are occurring, these people are dying, and you want us to evolve as a species, then you need to have positive pressure towards positive traits. And governments kill indiscriminately. They kill children, they kill women, they kill people who use plants a certain way, and that's not a biological incentive towards becoming a better organism. That's just crazy. And when you, one of my favorite examples is the seatbelt law, where they did risk assessment studies where they found that people who were risky drivers, when forced to wear a seatbelt because of legislation over in Europe, became less safe drivers because they had the increased assurance of a seatbelt that they were forced to wear. Now, people don't do these calculations consciously all the time. They're not thinking, oh, well, I'm wearing a seatbelt now so I can drive more risky. It's just sort of a subconscious thing that they felt a little more secure and they drove a little faster. And they found in Europe that when they enacted seatbelt laws, that death in automobiles went down. Simultaneously, they found that pedestrian and bicyclist deaths from getting hit by cars went up. Now, the death from the deaths of these cyclists and pedestrians did not equal the number of lives saved by seatbelts. However, when you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, the people who are out there exercising are the people that you don't want getting hit by cars. The people who are in cars driving recklessly in a evolutionary sense are the people that if you had to pick between the two, I don't want anybody to die, but the person driving recklessly, he gets the consequences of his actions. That's what drives evolution. When you directly pay the consequences for your own actions instead of someone else having to pay those consequences. It's like biofeedback. It gives you the information you need to make a better decision next time, or to be removed because you failed to make the right decision enough times.
Absolutely. And a lot of people have been skeptical when I've presented a similar argument. And usually what I do then is I point them to the actual insurance industries that exist today. The automobile industry, life insurance, those types of industries, because they actually have a term that they apply very broadly to encompass what they call moral hazard, which is simply the idea that, because I have insurance, or because insurance gives me a discount if I do these quote unquote safe things like wearing a seatbelt, then I can kind of withdraw from my safety account somewhere else. So because I have life insurance, now I can go ahead and get myself killed somehow, and it's okay because my family gets paid a bunch of money. So it's a win-win situation. Either I get to stay alive, or my family gets a bunch of money. Or if I have a car and I have insurance on that car, then it's a win-win situation. Either I get to keep my car, or I get to get a new car when this one gets totaled. And it again sends a sort of market signal, even if unconsciously we are aware of it. And that's what results in more motorcycle and bike and pedestrian accidents as opposed to car accidents when you force a seatbelt. So again, the benefit to kind of keeping a hands-off approach is twofold, where you send that positive bio feedback, as well as preventing people from feeling the inclination to take on irresponsible behaviors needlessly.
Absolutely. Another example of this that is directly as close to me in my industry is the handing over of responsibility for these risk assessments to government agencies. When you have the FDA and the EPA making these risk assessments for you, it gives people a false sense of security that these people are somehow brighter and better equipped to make these assessments than you are. And when you hand over that kind of control, you stop selecting for people that are able to think critically about their decisions, whether or not to bathe in a certain river or swim in a certain river, or to eat a particular kind of chemical, as in medications. And it's twofold, because there are people who are saved because they would just pop any pill in their mouth and otherwise remove themselves from the gene pool. But then alternatively, there are people who would make a positive risk assessment and they would say, I'm willing to try this cancer treatment, or I'm willing to try this experimental surgery, which could potentially not only save their lives, but open up an entire new field of research that could save millions more. The lost opportunity cost in some of these medications that get railroaded should be purely because it costs more to bring it to market through government regulations than they would make from it in the end due to the population size of the end consumer. It's the opportunity cost in saved lives of critically thinking, hardworking individuals is incalculable.
Yeah. That actually ties nicely back to a question I wanted to ask back when we were talking about cities, where if you were to say, cities in an anarchist society wouldn't necessarily be as population dense, or at least they wouldn't be as prominent as they are now. There would be more space between individuals. There would be more opportunity for sustainable environments. For instance, the supply trains going into cities versus the supply trains required for self-sufficient smaller communities. A lot of times when you're talking about this sort of thing, people will approach it from the perspective of, you're just a utopian. You want to get rid of our cities and then that'll solve all our problems because, something human condition, you're a Hobbesian or you're a Rousseau and you need to stop with your utopian dreams. But do you think that there's an economic argument that could be made that would just say it would happen naturally if the market signals allowed for it?
Absolutely. I mean, the closest thing we have, I think, to being able to describe this is early America. Before the government became so big, before the federal government had the power to tax the people, at one point there were companies that were beginning in the United States. Cities formed naturally. They certainly weren't as big as they are now, but they centered around trade centers. So there were natural points. There were waterways and transportation, nexuses of transportation, where people congregated because there was a need for lots of goods and services to flow through those areas in order to spread out to places people wanted to live. And if it's sustainable, I believe, when you have appropriate economic incentives for the transportation systems of these goods. So if DuPont or another large Fortune 100 company, CSX is a train company, have an agreement to transport, let's say, fertilizer, they're going to try and maximize not only the efficiency of their route, but also the security of their route. They want to make sure that consistently the goods get from one place to another. And they'll build strong bridges, they'll build multiple routes, they'll diversify their distribution locations, they'll do all these things. But when you have governments going in and saying where you can and can't build routes, and then not only that, but forcing people to pay for roads. When you force people to pay for roads, and then you have someone who has no idea what the economic incentives are for where roads should be optimally placed, you end up with this haphazard system where they just build roads close to roads, and it's easier to connect roads closer to roads, and people want to live on roads. I think that it's the road system basically that's given us the current structure.
That makes perfect sense as well if you look at it from I guess you could call it the economic assessment of the road builders. If they're given a specific budget, say, we've stolen X millions of dollars from the taxpayers, and now you need to build roads with X millions of dollars, it would make more sense to build the roads densely packed on top of each other with just enough space in between for the taxpayers to live, as opposed to spreading these roads out over a great distance simply because you get more bang for your buck building the roads, in which case the cost-benefit analysis skews in favor of the road builders building population-dense areas because the homeowners are beholden to the roads that are in existence, again, because the government says you're not allowed to build extra roads where the road builders didn't decide to build them.
Well, and even if they're allowed to build roads, you have this economic incentive where it costs a lot to build a road. So if you don't have to build a road, you're not going to. And it subsidizes the transportation of goods and services. So DuPont or CSX doesn't, or some other, let's pick a new company, Walmart doesn't have to pay to build the roads to transport its goods from its distribution centers to its stores. The government does that for them. It's basically, we're subsidizing corporations to get bigger than they should be able to, because they don't have to sustain their own infrastructure.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of it from the perspective of subsidizing corporations. On that note, that can kind of bring us around to a point that I think was our first discussion after we met each other through the Sovereign Tech podcast with Brian Sovereign, which was a very brief conversation about the anarcho-capitalist versus the anarcho-communist divide. I was wondering if you wanted to give me just your general opinion of ANCOMs versus ANCAPs, or the general environment of, for lack of a better term, politics within the anarchist world.
Yeah, so there's a problem with ownership that I have, and that's with land. Land is a limited resource, and biologically speaking, there shouldn't be a limitation for the expansion of a species, or else it starts to die. You have a growth phase or lag phase where things are real low, like you have plenty of room to grow. And then you have a growth phase where you start growing really quickly. At some point, when you start running out of free space, then you have to find ways of sharing what's left so that everybody can have some space. But it doesn't, I don't know that it makes it right. Because every bit of land that's owned today was owned by someone in the past, I guess. And at some point, somebody was pushed off that land. The same way we do with different species. When we expand into wooded areas, we push out the owls, the squirrels, the chipmunks, the deer, and they have to go find somewhere else. And they find less and less places to go, and species become extinct time and time again. And we did the same thing with humans. The Spanish explorers and the Europeans of all kinds, they colonized and they pushed people out, and they basically took over habitats of other people and claimed it as their own through force. So every time an ANCAP says, I own this land, I should do what I want with it, I cringe inside, because that land wasn't, I mean, you may have paid for it, but if you follow that chain back, there was no rightful claim to ownership except violence at the terminal end of that. Somebody took it from somebody, even if it was just animals. And I guess that could be the rightful owner way back then. But so, and I don't like the idea of population restriction. That's not the right idea.
No, that's an interesting line of reasoning. I didn't used to have an issue with land ownership, and then of all things, listening to Brian Sovereign, he kind of made me start reconsidering some of my preconceived notions about ownership and about property and about land and that sort of thing. I used to be a communist. I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I think I've mentioned it to you. Yeah. That's what started this conversation in the first place. However, obviously now I'm not a communist if I'm an anarchist. I am sympathetic to the red and black persuasion as opposed to the red and yellow persuasion, or black and yellow persuasion. That's ANCOMs versus ANCAPs. However, I still hang somewhere in the balance. I think I've made a blog post about this before in the past too. But the issue of land ownership, I think, can be partly solved, at least, by Locke's formula for homesteading, where if I mix my labor or my resources with an apparently unclaimed resource, for instance, the land, that I could be said to own the land that I have mixed my labor with. So if I till a field and plant crops, then that field is mine, virtue of my labor. And not to defend the genocide against the Reds in America, but a lot of people would make the claim, a lot of even very liberal individuals would make the claim that the Indians didn't do anything that would mix their labor with the land. They weren't planting fields or building cities, or they simply moved across the land as a means of transportation. So wouldn't that ultimately trace the line of ownership back to whoever first tilled the soil or built a fence or something like that?
I like that. I guess when I think of it as a resource, if you look at land as a resource, just as I would oil or natural gas, I guess the first person to it is, we need people to spread out over the globe, I guess, and optimize resources. So if some land's being unused, then I would agree that someone should be able to mix their labor with it and use it. So it's the absentee landowner that I guess I would have a problem with, where you have huge swaths of Nevada that the government owns and nobody's allowed to do anything with. And it prevents people, I mean, there's other places, there's wealthy people who just own islands that nobody's allowed to develop, where you need to be able to let people find their space to get to be able to produce to the best of their ability. Otherwise, you have idle hands, basically, and that's what a third of our government, or a third of our United States are government workers, who are, not all of them are idle hands. I guess the post office could be said to provide a service, but a lot of paper pushers that are not mixing their work with resources to produce goods, but yet claiming resources on the earth in the way of land. And that's not, I don't want that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Of course, I would kind of prefer government agents to be lackadaisical as opposed to proactive. I'd much rather the FBI, the NSA, the local law enforcement to sit on their hands and receive a paycheck as opposed to going out and extorting and caging individuals for being free. But I definitely agree with your sentiment that the idea is essentially that government by default is feudalism, where they arbitrarily claim ownership of a large portion of land, and then they demand rent payments via property taxes, or they demand any sort of resource that comes from that ground be taxed at least in one way, but usually 100%, 200% over by the time it ends up in the hands of the consumers. So it definitely makes sense that somebody would want to avoid a circumstance, even in a quote unquote free society, where it would look very similar to feudalism. I actually made a post about this last week when a friend prompted me to refute his claim that anarcho-capitalism can become feudalism. And honestly, I can't deny that claim. That sometimes in an anarchist world, you end up with governments, and governments are feudalism. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the world we're in today. I may not have been born an anarchist, but I do think that humanity was born as an anarchist species.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, animals are anarchists, right?
I would say so.
But it was civilization, I guess, the organization of us into groups to commit mass violence that allowed us to overcome other species and become the apex predator. So at some point, we're more organized than them. But something I go back to is the Dunbar number. And it's basically a number that represents the number of people that you can have in your community that you can actually have a relationship with. And the number varies for individuals, but it's roughly about 150 people for humans. And this number was fabricated after this Dunbar guy did it for apes. Basically, he looked at troops of apes and how many people or how many individuals they could have in their group and still maintain coherence before they started to have fights and one would be sent away. And it remained pretty static. With humans, that number is about 150. And when we have groups larger than that, you can't have any. When you have a group of that size, you're able to organize without having a government. You're able to care about each other, have empathy, to know each other well enough face to face that you're not going to be inclined to steal from them because you care about them. And within that group, at some point, though, we have expanded to a population size where you can't have groups that small because it's not practical. The only solution I've ever thought of that seems to make sense is we need more land.
So I've heard arguments made before that there's enough land, that's enough arable land with modern technology across the globe that everybody could just be given a specific plot of land. And I think it was something in the order of square miles. Mm-hmm. Like every human being alive could receive like 3 square miles of arable land, and everybody would have an equal share in the land. And, you know, that sort of argument definitely appealed to me when I was a communist. Looking at it from the anarchist perspective, though, I think if you were to remove all of the subsidies, all of the artificial economic signals for people to try to cluster together in more densely packed populations, that, like we said earlier, kind of spread out naturally to the point that maybe not everybody would have 3 square miles on every side to keep them safe from their neighbor, but that communities within the Dunbar number would naturally form, and they might even be geographically local to each other, but still have enough space in between them to have arable land, to have some sort of resource that they can pull from the earth or produce by some other means in order to share with these neighboring communities. Of course, when I say share, I mean sell, but I mean ultimately the end result remains the same, where I have a good and you have a service and we'll trade it. So you could have a sort of Sparta, if you will, subsidizing Athens' ability to do politics simply because Sparta's service fends off everybody but the Persians, and the Athenians then are able to do politics and have slaves that pull resources from the land in the form of food and bronze and those sorts of goods that they would then trade with Sparta. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, there would be groups that would be, well, and it kind of happens now. Like the United States is kind of like Sparta, and the people who ally themselves closely and relationally, at least within the leaders, um, they feel protected and they feel free to do other things. I find it interesting that the number of countries in the world is roughly approximate to the Dunbar number, and that basically I feel like we have kind of a static number of leaderships around the world that can kind of cooperate and get along with each other. And then on the edges of it, when you start to have, I guess when we had less than that, when we had more groups than that, they fought amongst each other and consolidated and grouped together. And it wasn't until recently, I guess, during the Cold War, that you kind of reached this stable number where they switched from mutually assured destruction to economically insured destruction, where there was enough trade links, like you're discussing with these small towns, that it prevents one from taking out the other because of the domino effect of how it would affect the group. And I feel like that's kind of where we've gotten to, where we've collected into found these organizational systems, these suboptimal organizational systems, to sort of organize ourselves in such a way that we can have leaders that can interact in a social way like that without having to do so as individuals.
I had never thought of it that way. I'm actually going to have to reassess my stance on the nature of societies as autonomous entities. I had never realized that the way that we tend to anthropomorphize countries, we'll say the United States did this and Germany did that and Russia did that, where each of those countries is a population of hundreds of millions of individuals. But we can effectively say that America invaded Europe in order to stop Nazi Germany, while at the same time Russia was invading Berlin, and these sorts of dynamics. And those all happen to land within the Dunbar number as a simple coincidence that may actually be somehow causally linked to the way that individuals' brains are developed. If I'm the leader of the free world, if I am the king of the world, aka the president of the United States, I need to keep track of 150 of my closest friends, Putin and Saddam Hussein and whoever the prime minister of England is these days, and etc. Though that would be the people within my Dunbar number from my perspective as a professional politician. That has just totally blown my mind. I don't know where to go from there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a coping mechanism. I think cells bacteria work in much the same way as the cells in your body. And anarchy I think of as like the bacteria, and the states are like more complex organisms. If you have if you have a state of evolution where you have a bunch of appendages that are just useless and a bunch of suboptimal systems that don't deliver things the way they should, you're going to see suboptimal outcomes for the cells, and you're going to be like, this is really stupid. And the United States kind of centered around trying to have a whole bunch of these little states that would each try different things, and you could evolve more quickly. But yeah, I don't know that it's working as well as I'd like it to, but
I'm still just totally floored with that. I'm going to have to do a lot of thinking and a lot of reading over the next couple of weeks. I was planning on taking December off to work on a book that I want to publish at the end of the year, but maybe I'll have to try to squeeze in a blog post at the end of this month, just addressing that in general, if I can come up to some sort of answer by that time.
Yeah, no, I would be interested if you do, because it's brought me to a question of what is good. Like, I used to think that I knew that good was, when you decide what to do, you always just know what's good. But how do you know? What's your base assumption? And as I've been trying to trace my base assumption back further and further and further, the simple idea that, oh, well, it's good for people not to die, that doesn't work, because then you overpopulate the world and everybody dies. Well, it's good to do unto your neighbor as you would like them to do unto you. Well, that's not always the case either, because people have different priorities for their own life. And maybe my priorities and what's good for me isn't good for him. And me trying to do what I think is good for my neighbor, or how I would want to be treated if I were him, is actually imposing on him something that's really terrible. So maybe if I were, say, a cocaine addict, I would want somebody to help me. But that doesn't mean that I need to go around finding all the cocaine addicts and trying to help them, because that's not necessarily what's good for them. And so then the larger picture, what's right for society, becomes a more complex issue. What is our goal? Is it expansion? Is it I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. That's where I got stuck biologically, because it seems like the purpose of every organism is to propagate itself into more organisms. And that's an unsustainable route.
No, that makes sense. I've actually done my best to kind of eradicate good and bad, or good and evil, from my vocabulary, not because I don't believe in some sort of objectively good thing or objectively bad thing. Again, I'm coming from a Catholic perspective here, so I can't say there's no such thing as good and evil, but God is all good and Satan's the bad guy, because those are mutually incompatible stances to hold. However, a lot of times when people are talking about good or bad, all that they're expressing, whether they think it's the case or not, is some sort of aesthetic preference.
Right.
Where I say, oh, this pizza is good, and freedom of choice is good. But then on the converse side, I could easily say, no, pizza's bad and abortion is bad, because I have a different aesthetic preference than you do. So then we'd have to appeal to some other concept besides good or bad in order to demonstrate whether or not an individual ought to pursue that course of action. For instance, if I'm lactose intolerant, pizza might not be the best option available to me. Or, if we're looking for the healthy perpetuation of a species, ignoring the possibility of certain genetic factors, abortion may not be one of the best options either. So it's kind of trying to explore these ideas from a different angle and just use different words than good or bad. For instance, when I'm talking about violations of the non-aggression principle, I refer to it as unjust or immoral. And then when we're talking about something that I call ethical, where it's like, what is my goal and how do I get it? The ethical choice would be the best way of achieving that goal. So if I want pizza right now, the ethical choice would probably be to terminate this conversation we have here and just order a pizza. However, if I would rather continue having this conversation, then I could wait until later to order a pizza. It all depends on what I want. And then the objective state of affairs dictates the best course of action to achieve that goal.
Right. And you're right. It's completely goal oriented. And the goal for humanity is what I was trying to get at, I guess, is I don't know what our goal is. I was raised in a Mennonite church. You may or may not have heard of them. But it's rather fundamentalist, pacifist. They're really, I don't know. They're not very free thinking. It's a very controlled environment. And when I was in there, everything was so easy. Everything was black and white, and I can see the appeal to it. But they all had the same kind of goal. They all knew what their purpose was, and the single vision was what allowed them to cooperate as a community, to pull together, and to do the things that they did. And because they had a goal, they could decide what was right or what was wrong. If you abstract that and say, well, I don't know that your goal is necessarily the best goal, and as organisms we all need to seek out our own goals, then, as you said, good becomes completely subjective to the goals of the individual.
Yeah. There was an idea that crossed my mind. Oh, I have an idea that I want to kind of try on for size. So I want your feedback on this one.
Okay.
So if we're trying to figure out what the goal of humanity is, or what I guess the more philosophical term would be the telos of humanity, but what are we directing ourselves towards as a collective whole? I would imagine that one possible way of kind of establishing this, of course, it'd have to be in hindsight, but that would be by looking at market forces. Ultimately, what is what humanity does is what humanity is designed to do by virtue of our genetic programming and our environmental influences and that sort of thing.
Right.
Would that make sense?
Absolutely. That's exactly the way I think about it.
Okay. So if I were a pessimist, then I would have to say that, well, if humanity started out as an anarchist society, and then over the course of 150,000 years or whatever, we developed governments and developed whole-scale warfare and came up with mutually assured destruction and then mutually assured economic destruction and these sorts of things, that if we continue along this line on the long enough timeline, we're going to continue to breed ourselves to be increasingly passive and increasingly militaristic simultaneously, to the point that we exterminate ourselves. So wouldn't the ultimate end of humanity, by virtue of market forces, be self-extinction?
I think it is, unless there's hope. unless we find a way to leave the planet. I think really the case would be if people were able to expand. We've kind of reached the edges of our aquarium, so to speak. And if we continue to push up against it, eventually we'll be like bacteria. When you grow beer, if you brew a batch of beer, as I've brewed so many, you have the yeast, you have a few, they grow up, they reach a maximum capacity, and they just fill their entire environment with their own crap. And then they die off. They produce a whole bunch of ethanol and then they're dead. And I think humans would do the exact same thing if you just continue to follow the market forces on this planet. And I think part of the problem we have with violence is because of the pressure we have pushing inwards from the outside that we can't expand out. If we find a way off, then I think that would relieve a lot of the pressure, especially if it was relatively inexpensive to pop off to another star, another galaxy, whatever it took. People would just spread out. When they felt oppressed by their government, they would just go to the edge, as they used to, cross the sea or go across the lake, or wherever they had to go. They would just get far enough away that that person with the club didn't bother them anymore and try and steal their berries.
Okay, that sounds good. So ultimately, what we have to hope for is that the violence inherent in the system is able to produce a multi-planet society before we fill the planet up with our own crap to the point that we die.
Yeah. And
so,
yeah.
You go ahead.
No, I was going to say something that I kind of had an answer that I think about is the answer to why our purpose, our heading, and that's the common thread through all life is data acquisition. The replication and the sustainability of each species seems to be primal to the continuation of the strand of DNA. They all want to continue their DNA and propagate it further and further. And with each successive species up the pyramid, they accumulate larger and larger quantities of DNA. They have more and more data, so to speak, on how to survive in the environment. And then as we've gotten into us as an apex species, we've begun data acquisition in a more general way, in a more abstract way, to be able to accumulate data about our environment, how to manipulate it, about the fundamental forces of nature. And these are all going into propagating us as a species, expanding our range. And ultimately, if we create artificial intelligence, it will be like the culmination of this process of creating the ultimate data acquisition structure.
Okay, no, that sounds really good too. In the context of data or entropy being represented as data, or vice versa, I'm not entirely sure how it tends to be represented anymore. And the acquisition of data then would in fact be an increase in entropy. Then it could tie back to, again, the kind of physics grounding of my interest in this whole process, which would just be to say that, the increasing entropy is the natural state of affairs in the universe. And so it would make sense that if we have an increasing entropic system, for instance, a certain biodiversity that allows evolution to higher information states or higher data states in our genetic structure and in whatever our brains seem to operate as data amalgamators and things like that, that it would be a natural process of the universe for this to continue as long as it is necessary before something that increases entropy more effectively comes along and scrambles everything even more. Or am I misunderstanding?
Scrambling entropy. Entropy is when entropy increases, the organization decreases. And so that you follow, I mean, that's reflects what you were saying, right?
Yes. I mean, as long as I'm trying to remember how exactly I've conceived of this in the past, but from what I recall about the way that people represent entropy as data or vice versa, is if you have a perfectly organized state of affairs with zero entropy, in the case of like a hard drive, is you'd have all zeros or all ones.
Oh, right.
Which would be basically meaningless. And then as we increase the state of entropy, we can have what we call data stored on that hard drive. We increase the number of ones and zeros, and they alternate a certain frequency or regularity, which allows us to interpret that as data. Right. And so true entropy would just be a totally random assortment of all noise across the entire spectrum, which, depending on who it is that's representing this, because I've seen different physicists try to represent this different ways, where they'd either say, well, what zero entropy is it's all zeros, and what full entropy is it's all ones. And I've seen other physicists say that a better approximation would be that one is all zeros or ones, and then the other is a perfect alternation of zeros and ones all the way through, because that's how you can optimize the amount of differentiation between each point on the grid or something like that. I don't know. I'm starting to talk outside my area of expertise.
No, I kind of follow. I had always understood entropy as an alternation, like perfect entropy would be an alternation of zeros and ones, kind of like where you have matter and antimatter and they would reach an equilibrium and then there'd be nothing. Everything would go cold and dark, because every up would have a canceling down. As far as having all ups or all downs, I guess those would be, I feel like that would be more like, I don't know what that would be. I guess that would be kind of a state of entropy, because there would be still no data. That's a really good question. I'm not a physicist either, but I did read a paper, I don't know if paper, an article about somebody who published concerning the idea that the universe is I guess a simulation, and he he has a theory that the dark energy that we're missing is basically the energy required to accurately depict the position of everything in the universe, and that as the universe changes, never mind, I'm totally off my game. I shouldn't try to speak outside my area of expertise. If you talk about biology, I can jump right back in. But
okay, that's no problem. We both kind of wandered outside our little comfort zone here and got ourselves a little bit lost. So let's go ahead and bring it back, and I'll just do more reading on entropy later on.
Okay.
So then I guess, converse to being a pessimist, then, if I were an optimist about the human condition, I would say something along the lines of, well, what government represents, what government really is it's a very, very small minority of individuals that happen to be just psychopathic enough to be able to get everybody else to march in line through the execution of violence. And so that market forces and evolution would dictate that either the end of humanity is to produce these psychopaths like we had before in the pessimistic case, or more optimistically, that this is a temporary a temporary derivation of the standard genetic code, so that on a long enough timeline, eventually that genetic strain of psychopathic rulers would go by the wayside in favor of the larger population of more peaceful individuals. And so that in hindsight, 200, 300, 400 years from now, maybe even 20 years from now, we would have a not more altruistic, because I hate that word, but a more peaceful species that's able to defend itself and able to to perpetuate itself more efficiently, but not with that, again, that towering structure of government as opposed to the pyramid structure of natural environmental factors or natural market resources. If we look at what's happening right now, where you have things like Uber and MadeSafe and all of the technologies that Brian Sovereign likes to talk about, but it's becoming increasingly popular, things like Bitcoin, where it's more decentralized and less prone to being controlled by a central psychopathic authority, that these market signals are already being sent that sometime in the future, what will be more profitable is the distributed, autonomous, private, and secure approach, the DApps approach, as opposed to some sort of centrally controlled and planned approach like we have with the cities that we've kind of covered are unsustainable. So I guess you've already said that you're a pessimist, and I wouldn't say I'm an optimist, but I do have to at least pretend that I lean more on the optimist side of things, simply because otherwise I'm not quite sure why I'm an anarchist.
No, that's right. I was pessimistic about expanding from the planet, but I am optimistic on Bitcoin. That's something you mentioned, Bitcoin and MadeSafe and these decentralized systems of information, where it does a great job of decentralizing power if it succeeds. I'm excited about it. I hope that it will. And if it does, like the problem is with the government, they control the land and you don't have anywhere to go. And so I'm afraid that in the end, even if you completely get out of the government tax system and you're only using Bitcoin all the time, that they'll still do the same thing that they did in feudal Europe, where they weren't taxed like on transactions. It was all cash. They couldn't. But what they could do is they say, if you want to live on this land, you have to pay me. And if it devolves into, we all have property taxes we pay, and if it just devolves into that where you just have to raise the property tax on everybody, then ultimately you'll still have the same thing. The state will hang on, and I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a big part of my problem with these sort of techno-optimists. I used to be a techno-optimist back when I was a communist. You can kind of see a common trait here where I was a little naive about the way that the human condition and about the way the world works. And so that led me to be very optimistic about compelling people to get along with each other, and very optimistic about technology's role in compelling people to get along with each other and that sort of thing. But even now, looking at the techno-optimists, they'll say, oh, well, Bitcoin will solve everything because it's decentralized and it can't be taxed properly and all these sorts of things. But you're absolutely right. There will be a different way to exert force and control and sustenance for these psychopaths in charge. One option that I've been considering personally that wouldn't necessarily solve the issue for everybody, but I'm seriously considering becoming a goat herder in the middle of the Sierra Madres in Mexico, where, of course, there is a government there, and they engage in rent-seeking activities where they demand property tax and that sort of thing. It's just much more difficult for the Mexican government to enforce property taxes in the depths of a series of arid mountain ranges than it is for, say, the United States federal government to exert property taxes anywhere on the planet. So it's kind of choose an enemy that you have a more fair fighting chance against. And I would imagine that looking at demographics and populations and the way that people are leaving America in droves kind of demonstrates that other people at least have a similar idea to mine. A lot of them are moving to Panama, or a lot of them are moving to Europe somewhere. Some of them are moving to Japan, or even some of them are expats to places like China, which kind of boggles my mind. But if we have so many people that are trying to leave the country now and go to these other nations, even if their status, can we be certain that they're not responding to the market signals that our federal government's engaging in too strong a rent-seeking activity, and they want to go somewhere else and do something a little further away from America's guns?
I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, either you fight or you run away. And anybody who's not willing to fight the government, which I'm sure not willing, then you're going to have to basically run to a place where they don't oppress you as badly as you can, worse than you can stand. And I think that'll drive people out of cities. And I think it already has. I mean, you're speaking of countries, which is accurate as well. But but even people who currently live in New York, they're going to start leaving places like New York and Detroit as the governments become so oppressive that they're like, I can't stand to live here. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, they move and then they bring their ideas with them. They're like, well, the New York government was corrupt, but if we do the same thing my way, then we'll get it right this time. And they just spread out in that way. It's funny you mentioned the Sierra Madre Mountains, though. That's I used to live in I think it's the Sierra Madres, just northern Mexico in Cuauhtemoc. It was an arid plateau in the desert where the Mennonites had built a community of their own. They basically, in the early 1900s, they left Canada, this group, because the government made government schooling mandatory, and that was the last straw for them. And they bought a couple 100 square miles of arid desert, uninhabitable land, according to the maps and the government, and they tiled it and they built watering, what do you call them, irrigation channels and everything, and they farm it now, and they produce massive amounts of corn for the city close by there. And that was a really interesting environment because they were able to do this in the middle of Mexico, where there's not allowed to be any guns. Like, that's illegal. They're not, I mean, they were a government in unto themselves. They had elders and they had campos. They had themselves organized into different churches because it was like 40,000 people. They had them organized into these groups where the eldership got to decide whether or not you build a house, whether or not you fit their model of society. And it was good for them. They didn't get bothered by the police, and they didn't have any problems with taxes and whatnot. And it was a good option. I mean, and then I speak a lot about end games because that's where my pessimism stems from. Eventually, if you have enough people, you fill up all those opportunities, and there aren't there anymore.
Huh. That's really interesting. I did not know about that. Are there any, I guess, resources available to learn about this? Like, I'm really interested. I want to read books or websites or something.
I didn't know they were there until I went there. But I mean, I guess I found out they were there before I went there. That's why I went there. But I got to learn about it through being there. And I went to church there, and it was an interesting thing. I'm sure if you search Mennonites in Mexico, I see there's a Wikipedia page where lists 100,000 Mennonites living in Mexico, and about 90,000 are established in the state of Chihuahua, which is where I was. So it's bigger than I thought it was. Okay,
that's amazing. That's actually really encouraging to me, because that sounds like, it sounds almost utopian in a certain sort of way, but it sounds like the intentional communities that I often harp on as a solution to, well, how are we going to have things that resemble cities in a free society? I'm like, well, if you get a bunch of people with similar ideas or a similar worldview, and they happen to get together someplace that they can take care of themselves, where they're relatively safe from wandering marauders or local governments or something like that, you could have some degree of success. And so a Mennonite area, a Mennonite village, intentional community, city, I'm not entirely sure what word to use there.
It's an intentional community. It's too sparsely populated for the massive area that it's in for there to actually be a city, but it's like a lot of connected towns where there's quesadillas, like where each little town will have its own like small cheese making business that collects the milk from that local area, and someone has silos and someone has like a little store, but it's so decentralized. I mean, it's basically exactly what I envision being good in an anarchist way.
That's amazing. And that's just north of where I have a little pin stuck in a map, and I'm like, that's where I'm going, and I am going to raise my goats and do my little aquaponics greenhouse, and I will bring all of my friends, and we will live happily ever after until the CIA, the drug cartels, or the Mexican government comes and tries to start something, and then we'll have issues. But I think it'll be a little more of a fair fight than, the Branch Davidians or somebody would face here in the United States.
The other thing I noticed there was you'd be surprised the economy there. So I traveled around Mexico, and there was just, you've seen pictures of just these people living in pallets covered with like slats of pieces of steel, and like just complete and utter dirt poverty.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
even around that area, there's these people called the Tarhumaras, where they're literally called dirt people in Mexico. And they live in caves, and they bathe in the river, and they wander around looking for food and things. But within this Mennonite community, it looks American. There's brick houses, there's interesting houses, there's palm trees, and some elaborate ones. There's what I would have understood to my community here in the United States, the modern hardware store with fast internet, and like these people were not. They were living above the standard of the surrounding area by a significant margin, and it was just they were just. All I can say is they were free from the government regulations. When they wanted to build a factory to make, they call it a factory. It's not really a factory. If they want to make cheese, they make cheese and they sell it. There's no one coming in and licensing them or regulating them or inspecting them. And within their community, everybody knows who works there, and they can trust the product, and they don't have any problem with it. The government's not saying, oh, you have to have this many cows, or they're not regulating their water supply. And it just works. And there's differences. There's many differences. With 90,000 people, you don't have one Mennonite church, and it's not like a uniform thought process. Within their faith, there's different. There's the first place I met evangelical Mennonites that I didn't even know existed, and the whole way back down to people who want buggies.
Terms.
That's what I thought. I laughed when I heard it, but they had like revival services and stuff, and it was really interesting. And so the way they've spread out, I mean, so far they haven't overpopulated their land area, so each new church was able to like kind of spread out and get their own little area and decide. I mean, they're pretty welcoming. If you want to join their area, then you just have to show them that you are interested in the rules of their community, and none of them are going to go to war or fight the other communities and like take over their land or anything. So there's this piece about it that, all right, you want to start another church that believes a little differently, then you go over here and you do that. And different areas were more successful than others. Clearly, they attracted more entrepreneurs or people who wanted to live a little more elaborately and didn't want to live the simple life. They wanted to build a more elaborate house or drive nicer cars or do things like that. And they had their own groups, and you ended up with with a really cool experiment in the middle of the desert.
That's really cool. Oh man, I'll have to look into this more. I spent a very brief period of time in Mexico. Are you familiar with Saltillo, the city?
Yes, I was there too.
Okay, yeah. So not too far outside of Saltillo is this little town called General Cepeda. It's spelled general, but it's in Spanish. So, but it's this tiny little town. It's bigger than some of the towns in Colorado. It's bigger than, say, Alamosa, but not by much. And it was amazing because in General Cepeda, adobe, dirt, brick houses, relatively poor. It was like a poorer neighborhood in Detroit or Chicago, but the people there were very positive individuals. I wouldn't necessarily call them optimistic in the philosophical sense. It seemed a lot like they were kind of just living their lives and waiting to die, which is really depressing. But they were very positive in their general outlook from day to day. There were people that were bedridden and very ill, and I was there for missionary work. So they were bedridden, very ill. They couldn't care for themselves anymore, but people would come and take care of them, and they were very grateful for that, and they did contribute to society because they were the oldest people in the city, and so they had a lot of things to teach to the people that came and helped them out. And there was, in a way, a mutual exchange of goods and services, even though it was kind of a, here's all of the things you need to survive because you're unable or unwilling to take care of yourself, but in return we're receiving the sort of the guidance of our elders. But all of the neighboring little ranchos, all the little neighborhoods around there were totally arid. They were houses made out of dirt and corrugated aluminum and very impoverished. And I wouldn't necessarily want to live in one of those ranchos, but just outside of General Cepeda, I've got a little spot picked out, and I'm like, yep, I'm going to find a way to purchase that block of land, and I'm going to put my goats there, and it'll be great. I'll bring a bunch of my white friends with me, and will improve the general quality of life in the area simply by having a resource to provide to, say, the economy in Saltillo. We could go to those little open air markets in the parking garages in Saltillo and sell goat cheese and things like that, and then bring the pesos back to General Cepeda to pay people for security, to be goat hands, that sort of thing. And it kind of, everybody wins that way. And so the only people that would have a problem with that would be governments.
It sounds like we might have gone on the same mission trip. I was taken out to a small village like that. That sounds very familiar, not too far from Saltillo, where there was just sort of cows walking in the streets and grazing around the town and dirt houses, and one pinball machine. And it was an interesting experience. I've often told my wife that someday I might just pull the ripcord, like. But yeah, no, it's definitely a solution, at least in the short term. And I think more people that do that, the better. There's an interesting post I saw on Facebook earlier where there was Neil Cavuto was interviewing a young girl about her belief in Bernie Sanders and how she needs to have colleges paid for, and that's the 1% should pay for it. And he asked her, so what happens when the 1% leaves? And she just sort of chuckled, like, well, there will always be a 1%. Like,
I mean, she's not wrong in saying there will always be a 1%. I mean, even in a communist society, there's still that 1% that has a little bit more than everybody else. But if I only have $5 and they have $7, taxing the people with $7 isn't exactly going to pay for my college.
No, exactly. And she won't be laughing once she becomes part of the 1%.
Yep. I mean, as that top line just moves down through the Elkions of society, eventually you're going to be the one being faced with that line moving over your income bracket.
Yeah. And I think the borders are the biggest hindrance to growth right now. Well, one of the biggest, because like you moving down there, you may not have to pay an exit tax, but that's what's keeping a lot of the wealth. Like that's their last grip on holding what power they have, is preventing the wealth from distributing itself evenly across the earth. Just as people should be distributed optimally, like wealth needs to be distributed optimally. And there's a lot more potential for growth in a place like Mexico than there is in the United States. The United States is falling, but the developing countries are growing like crazy. And they are going to demand goods and services just like we did the whole way up. And if the money could be allocated appropriately, I think you would see places like Saltillo all over the world that would become desirable places to live, because there would be investments there in small businesses, and I mean, that's a lot of it is when people talk about shipping jobs overseas, basically you're just reallocating resources to a place where there's more growth potential, where you can grow your business more because of the either less government regulation, lower cost of labor, all these kinds of things, proximity to water, proximity to coal, or whatever your resource is. But yeah, allocation, relocation, resource reallocation, and that'd be cool.
That expatriation tax, the exit tax, I mean, unless you make it absolutely 100%, we will take everything away from you if you try to leave, which has been attempted before. You know, East Germany is a prime example of that. I get the feeling that if Donald Trump becomes president and he builds his wall, in the words of Christopher Cantwell, it'll become the biggest tombstone on the largest mass grave in history, because everybody's going to want out and nobody's allowed out. But I do think you're right that eventually even the cost of an exit tax and all of the paperwork and all of the opportunity cost, for instance, if I want to move to Mexico legally, I'm going to have to leave my guns behind. Eventually, even those costs are not enough to make it worth the cost of staying here. It's seen before in Rome, in Southeast Asia, in Weimar Germany. It's happened time and again where these empires, which America by all definitions and historical standards is an empire, build themselves up and they conquer the world and they become the superpower. And eventually enough people in that society decide, you know, I don't like living in empire and I want to go somewhere else, that eventually the empire collapses from within, because the people that are being used as the support structures, the 1% and the laborers and those types of people, pull out. And then all that's left is what's essentially the middle class that need the 1% and the lower elkions of society to sustain them. The people living in the cities, the people that have these sorts of service jobs, where if there's nobody to do services for, and if there's no cities to sustain them, they end up falling prey to wandering hordes of marauders, the Mongols, the Huns, the Nazi party in Germany. You know, here in America, a lot of people are worried about ISIS and about China and about Russia. And I'm like, before we worry about that, maybe we should worry about what our government's going to do to keep us in and to keep them out. And then when that fails, it might not necessarily be a bad thing to hit the reset button. You know, there's nothing inherently good about the United States. It's all a matter of results. It's what do you want and how do you get it?
The fence thing's particularly close to my heart. My wife is from Eritrea, which was a small country that seceded from Ethiopia in 1992.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole country's fenced in, and if you leave, you take nothing with you. That's just that you can't take money out of the country. You can't take gold. You can't. I mean, they are they're completely a military state. Not, I guess, not quite equal to North Korea, because the only difference is that their government has so far collapsed that they don't have the economic ability to man it hardly. They control their people mostly through fear of you don't know who's a government agent, and it might be that somebody's watching you, when in reality they're just a skeleton of a state, and they're just grasping to try and maintain that fear to hold in the people weak-minded enough to still believe them. But so she left without anything, and her mother now lives with us, who left without anything except the clothes in her suitcase. And she has another brother in South Africa who's done the same thing. He was a refugee there for 10 years. Another one who's got refugee status in the United States. And then a sister who was smuggled across the border after she got a diversity visa offered by the United States in the trunk of a car. And then one more brother who actually, the other one got out and got accepted to a PhD program in the United States just before they closed down the borders. So he was on a plane getting ready to fly just as they were starting to make the announcement that people couldn't leave. And and they were just praying for him that that the plane would clear the airspace and get out of there, because the government didn't own the airlines. It was like Air Egypt or Lufthansa or one of these. Mm-hmm. They didn't have any respect for the government in that regard. Like, they're not going to land because you suddenly made a decree that one of our passengers needs to join your military. But and so then he got out and he got a PhD and he's good. But I've seen what walls can do, and it's a really sad thing, because everybody's smart enough to escape the cage will. And it's just a brain drain and a wealth drain. And as soon as you try and tell people they can't leave, they'll panic and try and get out, just like the stock market. If people are afraid that they're going to lose their ability to get their money back, they're going to make a run on the banks. If people feel like they don't have the ability to leave, like they're trapped, they will find a way to leave if they're able.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that about you at all, or I guess about your wife.
Yeah.
I only have a secondhand familiarity with those sorts of events. My family for the most part's been in America for generations, and so I have, I guess, what people call white privilege. I don't know the unfortunate reality of being closely related to people that have had to escape from socialist countries or escape from some sort of genocide or any of those issues, which I'm very thankful for. I mean, I don't often talk about desert, but nobody deserves to go through that process. Even the people that weren't smart enough to escape it, even though they don't deserve to become slaves and impoverished and starved into extinction and those sorts of, I guess, human experiences. But in a way, it is the only natural process. And I think that an optimist would say, oh, that's great. Enough of these examples and people stop falling for this shit. And the pessimist will say, no, it's been the same story as far back as you can tell. And again, I'm stuck in the middle ground here. And I'm like, well, I want to do the best that I can for me. I don't give a crap about the human condition as a whole, except for how to navigate it.
Right.
That's why goat herding in Mexico is a beneficial option. Before that, I kind of planned to move to New Hampshire to take advantage of the work that's been done by the Free State Project, but I haven't quite succeeded in getting work out there yet.
Yeah, that's the one bone to pick I have with the Free State Project is freedom looks so different to so many different people. And they've kind of self-selected a location that feels like freedom to a certain demographic of people that probably closely represents the demographics of the group that did the voting in the first place. But for me, the educational freedom in New Hampshire is poor. The job opportunities are poor. The property taxes, which in my opinion is the only tax you can't dodge, is very high. Whereas, so I lived in, I mean, I'm going to show my preference here, but I lived in Delaware for a little bit and the property taxes were rock bottom. There was no sales tax. And if you're going to do agorism, you don't worry about whether or not there's an income tax. The regulatory environment was low. If you wanted to homeschool your kids, you would just have to write a letter saying, this year my kids will be homeschooled, and they just accepted it. There was no mandate on curriculum. There was no yearly testing. There was no inspection to whether or not you're actually doing anything. It's felt very free to me for the purposes of what I was looking for. And we moved because of a job for my wife, and now I have to live in Pennsylvania, and I'm like, oh my gosh, is going from Delaware to Pennsylvania in those aspects that I just mentioned was like, ooh. Now if you want to home, it's just and Pennsylvania is still, I think, as good or better than New Hampshire on educational freedom. We can homeschool here, but you have to fill out lots of paperwork. You have to get approved curriculum. They want you to participate basically in their charter school where your kids will basically go to school online from your house and learn their indoctrination. So it's it sucks, but it's an economic optimization for me. For me, freedom looks a lot like being rich. And when you have enough money, you can kind of brush off the peripheral things. And so that's been my goal. And having climbed that ladder somewhat as a professional scientist, and my wife as well, I attempted to make that next step and start a business. And that's when I encountered regulations. First, I thought I would grow mushrooms, and I encountered regulations. You can't just go to a grocery store and sell them your mushrooms.
Nope.
And if I start peddling mushrooms on the street, it's going to look kind of bizarre. And so then I got into Uber, and then I found out, oh wow, in my area, Uber's illegal. It's a $2,000 civil fine and up to $2,500 criminal fine and a year in jail. And I'm like, holy crap. Well, I'm going to do it anyway. Civil disobedience. I'm going to do it. So then I do it, and then they don't withhold taxes, but they keep a log of everything, and they're going to submit it to the government at the end of the year of how much I made and what I drove. And so then I'm like, all right, well, how much is this tax going to cost me? And when you are self-employed, you try and start a business right off the top. You got to pay Social Security and Medicare, which totals 15%. Now, that's a big tax. 15% is pretty good. Well, then if you and your wife are both employed and make at least $45,000 a year, that gives you a household income of $90,000. You're going to be in a 25% federal income tax bracket. That means 40 cents on every dollar right off the top goes to the federal government on every dollar your new business makes. Furthermore, you have state taxes. In Pennsylvania, it's going to be about 5 or 6% at that tax bracket. So the wind resistance of anybody trying to actually build wealth and create a better society. I look at dollars as a measure of your contribution to society. If you are getting dollars, that means you are giving good things to other people, that you are doing positive, as long as it's honestly earned. Of course, as long as you're not working for the government, it should be ideally a measure of how much your positive contribution to society is. And they just make it impossible to get any headwind. So I figured out that I was earning $26 an hour driving Uber gross. After expenses, after taxes, all said and done, I'm making $7.26 an hour.
That's below minimum wage.
That's below minimum wage. It doesn't surprise me that nobody wants to start a business. And it's just so hard. And I mean, I'm glad for Uber, for the people that aren't in a higher tax bracket and they can do that. And that's great. But once I found that Uber was like an easy business to start for me, having a nice car and having a good neighborhood where I can start out of. And it's going to be that way with every business I try to start in the US. And then that brings me back to my self-optimization. And like, maybe I'll just pull the ripcord if I can't stand this. If I can't find a way to break through, actually start a business, begin to progress, then it's hopeless. And I think at this point, my next venture is going to be a smartphone app and sell it for Bitcoin or something.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to our conversation about how Bitcoin can be a liberating mechanism where it's PayPal without the taxes.
Yeah,
at least that's how
exactly.
a lot of people tend to use it. I've been paid a little bit of Bitcoin for writing opinion pieces for people or doing people's homework for them, things like that aren't exactly necessarily profitable ventures in a large scale. I couldn't fund myself and my family doing other people's homework for them for their college whatever courses. But it is a nice little bit of money to make on the side that is totally untraceable. Like, there's no way that the government, even with all of the NSA devices, could pick back through the metadata and find, this $20 worth of crap I've got on my computer, basically.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. And that's where I see Bitcoin as being really beneficial, is in the acquisition of personal freedom. Maybe it won't save the world because of, like I said, property taxes, but it can at least save me. It can at least allow me to accumulate something and really own something. When you own land or cars or things, all these things can be taken from you. The government can just take it. And they do. They impound cars all the time. They kick people out of their homes for not paying property taxes. But with Bitcoin, at least theoretically, you could memorize your private key and they cannot take that from you. There's nothing about that they can take. And it represents real wealth that you can save for later. And that's a really powerful thing.
It is. We're coming up to the end of the time I have available right now. My family's about to come home. I have so many more questions that I want to discuss with you. I want to talk about the use of force and self-defense. The other day on Facebook, you asked me, has anybody ever argued that aggression is okay? And that sparked a series of fun conversations with my Facebook friends, and I wanted to follow up on that. But I guess as one final question, I guess for the day then, would be, do you think that it would be a efficacious influence on the market if individuals such as yourself and myself simply pursue what makes us free without worrying so much about the big picture, and succeeding in that regard, if that would encourage enough other people to begin acquiring freedom for themselves and not worrying so much about the big picture? I mean, the obvious answer or obvious example is I was listening to the Republican debate the other night. It's a thing that I hate to do, but somehow being radically apolitical makes everybody want your opinion on politics. It's like asking an atheist what they think about the differences between Taoism and Buddhism or something. And it's like, why are you asking me? But, they keep presenting these plans. It's like, oh, we're going to make America great and we're going to make the world free by doing all this stuff to everybody in the world or everybody in the country. And I keep asking myself, wouldn't it make more sense if you just focus on doing what's good for you and I focus on what's doing good for me? And then because economics, then the proper market signals will be sent for people to pursue freedom and personal responsibility as opposed to whatever random subsidies happen to be in place.
That's what with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When people were pursuing their own happiness, it produced what we have today. It produced the United States of America. It produced Western culture where we have abundance. And I think that if we were permitted to pursue that, I think the regulations and constrictions in place are what preventing us to pursue our own individual happiness. And they try and get us to rally around various disasters or big picture ideas. And it's skewing the market away from people being happy. And not only do you produce less than you would have otherwise, but people are more upset about it in the process. You have more depression, more cases of violence against others as people are just frustrated and angry, and they don't know why. They don't know why they can't succeed in life in the way that they want to. They want to be happy, they take pills, to do whatever they can. But yeah, absolutely. We all need to be pursuing our own happiness.
So in other words, the things that people tend to turn to and say the state would protect us from X, the things that they're protecting us from are actually the symptoms of their own existence as opposed to an actual problem that needs to be dealt with in the absence of the state. Or am I making your argument a little too broad and aggressive there?
No. I agree with that. That's a good way of saying it in a succinct way.
Well, thank you very much for your time. This is the first time I've ever tried to do some sort of interview that wasn't for a job over Skype or Google Hangouts or something. I've never spoken to you in person or using voice technology before, so this has been great. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Very glad that Brian accidentally screwed up his feed on Soundcloud and sent you over to my blog.
Yeah, that was really cool. So I'll look forward to talking to you in the future, but I'm going to get some dinner now.
Oh, most definitely. Would you mind just plugging your website one more time? I'm sure there's good ideas on it, and I want my readers to go to your site as well.
Yeah, it's infrequently updated, but it's benshade.com.
Okay, well, I've got about 6 readers, so you'll probably get about one of those. So I'm happy to contribute one reader to your cause. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll talk to you later.
Later.